On October 30th, 2008, at a campaign rally in Columbia, Missouri, then Democrat presidential candidate Barack Obama made the statement, "We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America." Now, this line was met with thunderous applause from those in attendance, but only a minority of informed insiders knew precisely what he was referring to. The uninformed supporters were blissfully ignorant of his true intent. And just what was Obama referring to? Over the next series of episodes, Dr. Tom and I are going to illustrate how destructive maneuvers are falling into place in the United States. We'd like to remind Americans of how the lessons learned from the last century are going unheeded by a relaxed and distracted population. Now, you'll hear bits and pieces of what we're about to discuss on other conservative platforms. But no one will put all the concepts together the way we will today. Our goal is to help explain to you why the changes that most of us cannot seem to fathom are happening. We hope to analyze how our federal government is being morphed into something that would only be recognized by the Founding Fathers as despotism. America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 24 of the Liberty Brief Podcast, Rising Despotism, Analyzing America's Destruction, with our guest, Dr. Thomas Giordano, author of the book, Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. I'd ask you to please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also comment on this or any of our podcast series. So let's begin. Before I introduce Dr. Tom, I'd like to give a shout out to retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Bud Cornwell of the Patriot Cause podcast. You can view this and his other podcasts by searching on Podbean, Apple, or Rumble and subscribing. Gunny was such a gracious host, and Dr. Tom had a great time discussing from his perspective in Italy how the United States is viewed in some parts of Europe. In fact, the first interview went so well that Gunny invited Dr. Tom back for a second, and we are making plans to have him on our podcast soon. So with that, let me say hi to Dr. Tom.
Yo, Rob, how's it going? Looks like we found a new friend in Gunny.
Yes, it does.
Let's make sure we put a link to his podcast page on Podbean in the description.
And I'll make sure the team has it there for anyone else who's interested. All right, Dr. Tom, we've been on a short hiatus and a lot of things have been happening. Now, I know that we were planning a single episode, but now we've decided on a small series of shorter episodes with a common theme. Can you tell our listeners why?
Sure. I started with the idea to research the degradation of our judicial system and federal policing. It is by now evident that our America is not what was intended for us. With the persecution of Donald Trump, his lawyers, his presidential staff, and his political advisors, the cat has been let out of the bag. We're looking at a Soviet-style show trial or a Nazi people's court sideshow. These are nothing more than public displays by authoritarian miscreants. Seeing these parallels, my research began to go off in even more profound directions, and it suddenly dawned on me that I was looking at just one of four converging tactics to transform our constitutional federal republic into a European-style Soviet system leading to an authoritarian control.
Well, that's a big statement, but so let me start out. What do you think Obama was referring to in that campaign speech in Missouri?
Well, that's exactly what my conclusion was, that that's what he was referring to. He was openly implying that the progressive Marxist plan to turn the United States of America into a European-style form of Soviet socialism was finally about to happen. To his mind, the goal of purging our unique American experiment, the only ideological, political, and physical obstacle to the failed Marxist objective of world domination, was close at hand. Obama and his like-minded Marxist ideologues were absolutely giddy about the prospect of bringing the freest, most prosperous, most productive country the world has ever known to its knees and subjugating it to a neo-feudalism of a neo-Marxist authoritarian regime. They jumped the gun, however, and 8 years later, the election of Donald J. Trump threw a monkey wrench into their final attempts to transform the country. Leftist desperation created an explosive reaction and exposed what was progressing very slowly and quietly in the shadows behind our backs. And it continues to this day.
All right, Dr. Tom, how do we approach this subject? In previous episodes, we discussed what the founders had in mind for us and why. Maybe we should begin with a brief summary of what we went over in detail and then go on from there. In other words, let's remind our fellow citizens what the Marxists are trying to transform us from.
Well, that sounds like a plan. But first, I think it might be better to set down what the progressive Marxist tactics are. I would also like to give an observation that I've noticed from the takeover here in Europe. I would like to state them clearly right from the onset.
Well, I'm hoping that we can show that their strategy is obvious by now. In the email you sent me while I was out, when I was out west, you mentioned count them, 4 interconnected tactics. For our audience, what are they?
From my observations, after a little more than 100 years of stealthy and cunning planning and execution, the leftists are on the verge of uniting 4 interdependent tactics to fulfill their strategy. The first tactic is centralization and the complete conversion at all levels of our federal republic into a direct vote democracy, essentially creating an autocracy, okay? The second has, for the most part, already happened. The transition of certain investigative agencies of the government into surveillance agencies. Without sugarcoating, they have become a secret police force. 3-letter agencies, FBI, CIA, etc. The third is politicizing the judicial system to eliminate its independence and making it a tool for those in government to act on the intrusiveness of that secret police. And the fourth tactic has already been set up as well. It is the formation of the Soviet infrastructure within many federal agencies with regulatory authority. If you notice, their unresponsiveness to congressional oversight and their anonymous passing of rules and regulations which impact the lives of every American demonstrates that these alphabet agencies have already been converted by definition into outright Soviet commissions. Now, this is a multi-pronged assault on our federal government. In addition to this, there is also the fifth related diversionary tactic of destroying our culture and society. Anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear can perceive that American society, in fact, the Western world, has been infected with the disease of neo-Marxist or postmodern relativism. Right? There is now an Hegelian dialectic for practically every aspect of human activity and expression.
Well, Dr. Tom, now, that's one hell of a lot to unpack. Okay, so I'm taking notes. So first things first, the centralization and complete conversion at all levels of our federal republic into a direct vote democracy. Now, I know we went over all of this in previous episodes of the Liberty Brief, but for the sake of clarity, can you give our listeners a brief summary of the structure of the federal government? I mean, what was the U.S. designed to be and why?
Well, Rob, as you know, the federal government was not designed to be a direct vote democracy. It is never even mentioned or referred to in the Constitution. Since the federal government was a compact or a commercial charter between the original newly constituted nation states, the founders, at the insistence of Ben Franklin, adopted the idea of federalism from Chief Kanasatego of the Onondaga Nation of the Iroquois Confederacy of the Six Nations.
Yes, I remember you giving us the history of how that all came about in episode 6, where we discussed the uniqueness of the Constitution. Now, without going into all their reasons, like maintaining individual personal rights and state sovereignty, which we know well, let's just stick to the infrastructure of the federal government.
All right, fine. The overarching organization had to remain free from centralization and a creeping degeneration into despotism. Okay? Being students of classical Greek and Roman history, along with the contemporary philosophers of the Enlightenment, our founders decided on incorporating what the Greeks would have called a mixed constitutional form of government. This was what was referred to as an ideal polis, or a kala polis, or a politeia in Greek. It was to bring all of the positive aspects of the ancient forms of government together and avoid tyranny through the separation of powers and a method of checks and balances to curtail immoral self-interests from taking control. In other words, they knew they could not trust the people to be virtuous. In fact, they had to assume that they weren't and never would be. History was just too full of examples proving the point.
Yes, I see. So, as I recall, the founders set up the House of Representatives to be a direct vote democratic body representing the people's interests, and then the Senate as being an aristocracy in the ancient Greek tradition of the word to make up the legislative branch. And then the executive branch was to be a benevolent monarchy, with the judicial branch like the Greek and Roman timocracy or gerontocracy, depending on how one looks at it. Those are all big words. I'm glad I got through that.
Yeah, well, timocracy is the power to the wisest, and gerontocracy is the power to the oldest.
Right,
because they figured the older people would be wise. Right.
You're teaching me, and it might surprise you, but I am learning.
Okay. Well, I thought you would have already known this from the past when we went over all the Greek forms of government.
What can I tell you?
Exactly.
I'm a lousy student.
Nah, you're not a lousy student. But anyway, you're exactly right. And their reasoning was that each co-equal branch of the government would check the power of the others and prevent the degeneration of these ancient forms of government into a tyranny at the executive level, an oligarchy in the Senate, an oligarchia or demokratia paranamos, that is mob rule, in the House. Okay?
Well, I don't think we've accomplished that at this point. But we'll get to that later. What about the judicial branch? Why did the founders want to keep it independent from the other two branches?
Oh, that's easy. Ask Socrates.
Yeah.
I'll tell you. No, all kidding aside, the intellectual origins of a distinct independent judicial power can be traced all the way back to Aristotle's theory of a mixed constitution. This was also brought to light by many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, people like Montesquieu. John Adams was an important player in formulating these ideas to adapt them to our needs. The debates during the framing and ratification of the federal Constitution regarding the independence of the federal judiciary and respecting judicial review was a topic of discussion in every one of the newly constituted states before, during, and after the ratification of the federal Constitution. Okay? The reason was that this was a relatively new concept in their time. During our early colonial history, the judiciary as an independent branch of government hardly existed, as a separate entity before the revolution. In many cases, the admiralty courts overrode local colonial laws and adjudications at the behest of the British Crown. But that's why they wanted to separate it. It was fresh in their minds. Also, the idea of a separation of judicial authority was not really precisely formulated at the time of the founding of our federal government. In fact, state legislatures, following the traditions that they had known in the 1780s, regularly overruled judicial decisions The courts began to question these activities in about 1820. To become a genuinely co-equal branch, the judiciary implicitly agreed to keep out of partisan politics. And in return, officials within the executive branch cemented the idea that the executive and the legislative branches could not interfere with judicial proceedings.
You know, Dr. Tom, it seems obvious to me, maybe I'm thinking in hindsight, but it seems obvious to me that the rule of law, due process, and its equal application cannot exist without an independent judiciary. Where am I going wrong?
Oh, you're right. Sure. Absolutely. Ever since the Bronze Age. History has shown us that anywhere the judicial powers become a tool of either an assembly or an executive or both, despotism follows. We don't even have to go back that far in history. Look at any authoritarian regime from the last century until the present day. It becomes merely window dressing to provide the appearance of legality through a farcical judicial process, that masks iron-fisted control. It becomes a primary tool to produce fear of retribution or subservient obedience in a population. But let's not get sidetracked here. We'll get to this in more detail when we deal with two of the other tactics, okay? They are important, but we'll deal with that later.
All right, well, I'm on the edge of my seat, but for now we have a framework for this first part of our discussion. I'd like to first discuss centralization and then why they have to make our country a direct vote democracy. Exactly what's been done in the U.S. to centralize the federal government, and why is it so bad?
Oh, geez, from the beginning, centralization was an Hamiltonian desire that was rejected by people like Jefferson and Mason. We went over George Mason. It was precisely what we did not want, right? The constitutional framework of the government is the most compelling testimony to that fact. Really, think about it. Do you need 3 co-equal branches of government if it were to be centralized? Do they have to be spelled out in the Constitution? And believe it or not, the first step towards centralization of the federal government was the outcome of the Civil War. Believe me, I think Lincoln was a great man and a tragic figure, but his desire to hold the Union together by anti-constitutional means was the first step towards centralized power in Washington. Even in common speech, before the war, our country was referred to as these United States, in the plural, indicating the compact nature of the union of independent nation states. After the war, the country started to be called the United States, okay? So these were substituted with the word the. We were now one nation. It's even in the Pledge of Allegiance. Our federal government was never intended to be one nation, but a federation of many nations.
Well, I remember having to read some of the Federalist Papers, and these ideas were expressed clearly before the ratification. So I'd like to state clearly why the centralization of power in a governing body is dangerous. I did read your book, so I have an up on that, and I'm pretty sure I already know what you're going to say.
Yeah. Well, it really is quite simple. Centralizing power makes it too tempting and too easy for an individual or a small group of individuals to grab control of the machinery of government and bend it to their will. Just in the last 150 years, look at the Bolsheviks' October Revolution of 1917 and how that came about. Look at the Nazis. Hitler would never have been able to take over the entire sphere of the German-speaking world before the unification of Germany in 1879, and then its further consolidation after the First World War. It was handed over to him by von Hindenburg, when he named Hitler chancellor. Adolf Hitler was never elected to anything. Okay? Look at Mussolini. Same thing. It was the so-called unification of Italy. And I call it so-called because it was an invasion of the North into the South. It was no unification. It was a colonization. But let be that as it may, it was the unification of Italy in 1870 that laid the groundwork for Mussolini's power grab. Okay? Had the peninsula still been divided into many principalities and papal states in the north and the kingdom of the two Sicilies in the south, the fascist march on Rome in 1922 and the subsequent backing of the Savoy monarchy would have meant very little, and certainly would have posed little to no threat to his neighbors. How many examples do we have to cite from history? I mean, even Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Polybius warned us of this danger.
Well, I guess this is a pretty clear argument to avoid centralized power in a government. In any case, you won't get any argument from me on this matter, and I think anyone would be hard-pressed to deny these claims. But let's get back to it. What about direct vote democracy? How many people in our country refer to the government as a democracy without even thinking, or a threat to our democracy? You and I both know that's not the case.
It is really amazing, isn't it? They've been convinced that we live in a democracy. That's just not the case. As I mentioned before, we know that given enough time, democracy can degenerate into mob rule, a tyranny of the majority, as Jefferson called it. In our case, the House of Representatives was created as a direct vote democracy. But the other part of the legislature was not. The Senate was created to protect the member states' sovereignty. Now, the question you have to ask is very simple. After the post-Civil War transfer of control to Washington by the force of arms, what was the purpose of protecting a sovereignty the states no longer had? Okay? I mean, nobody ever asked that question. But I'll tell you what it led to. It led to the second step in the transformation, and that was the 17th Amendment in 1913. It made sure that the member nation states' ability to protect whatever vestiges of sovereignty Americans thought their states had in D.C. was definitely eradicated by turning that part of the legislature into a direct vote democracy. State assemblies could no longer select their two senators, and that aristocracy has degenerated into a self-serving oligarchy. They are no longer there to check the insanity of the House and block harmful legislation.
Well, most of the senators that I'm thinking about right now are insane themselves. So
there are a few examples of that are sane, but they're few and far between. Few and far between.
So if I follow your observation, you're saying that the final step is to go after the Electoral College and flip the election of the executive branch into a direct vote democracy too. Now, didn't we already talked about that in a previous podcast? Am I right?
Yes, we did. Yes, we went over that. The Marxists have been trying to abolish the Electoral College since at least the early 1970s. They've even made proposals for it. Once that is done, nothing prevents packing the Supreme Court with partisan ideologues, and the Republic is dead. Okay? Nothing prevents the president from proposing and the Senate from rubber stamping an expansion of the Supreme Court. All right? Now, let's state this clearly and with no ambiguity. An autocratic-minded political party, like the Democrats, convincing a population they have a say in government through a direct vote democratic structure is a sick joke. It's a lie. It is a cunning illusion of a franchise that means nothing. It is merely appeasement because those in control know there are more people in the population that can rise up against them than there are holding the reins of power. I mean, think about it. How many autocracies, how many dictatorships, socialist and communist states called themselves democrat republics? How many of them abolished all other dissenting voices and wound up with only one political party, okay? Who runs the election and counts the votes? How could it possibly matter what the final count is if there's only one party? Hell, if voting mattered, they wouldn't let you do it.
Ah, boy, oh boy. This makes sense to me. And who can deny that this happened, for instance, in, say, California?
Oh, yeah. It's happening in every Democrat-run city. Is it really necessary to list them? If America wants to see its future under Democrat control, just do a YouTube search for Kensington Avenue in Philadelphia. That'll tell you everything. That'll show you everything you want to know. They're trying to turn us into a friggin' Calcutta.
Is it really necessary to vote for mayors in various cities like Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York?
I mean, you've got these machines running these cities for decades.
Yeah. Well, I believe you. And it's apparent to me. Okay, so we can agree that the first tactic is to centralize power. And we're well on our way to doing that. And we know the consequences won't be good. The combination of direct vote democracy with centralized power is very dangerous. You sold me.
Okay.
Now, what would our counter tactic be? We always give a cure for the issues we discuss, and what would it be in this case?
Well, you can't rely on people in government to curtail their own power. There's no way in hell the Senate would pass something returning the Senate to the control of the states' assemblies. No way in hell that would happen. Okay? So we have to look to the Article 5 Convention of the States, where 2/3 of the states meet to propose and then ratify amendments to the Constitution. I've been following them, and they've got to set their primary priority to include the repeal of the 17th Amendment. I mean, I followed this recent mock-up that they did. They didn't even mention the structure of government. You know, we have to reconfirm and return the Senate to the individual states' assemblies. They were not intended to represent the people. They were representing the states, okay? State legislatures could then go back to recalling them at any time, too. You won't have people like McConnell, Schumer, and Feinstein, occupying a position for 60 years, for the rest of their lives. And we certainly won't have, a meat puppet like Fetterman there. That would never happen. That would go towards eliminating the corruption and self-interest that's apparent there now. It is an oligarchy, plain and simple. The second would be to propose an amendment to make the election of the executive branch by an electoral college inviolable. We cannot turn that into a direct vote democracy. That's exactly what we did not want with the creation of our government.
All right. Well, Tom, I think you've succinctly defined the issues with centralizing government. And we've exposed the Marxists' first tactic of centralization, along with the conversion of our representative republic into a direct vote democracy. So if you, the audience, were intrigued with our views, please join us for our next episode. We hope to shine a light on the American secret police. How many agencies of our federal government have been converted to surveillance agencies, essentially thumbing their nose at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And think about this. Think about how many of these agencies are being armed by the federal government. And you have to ask yourself why. Well, this starts to give an answer for that question. Why are they arming these agencies?
Well, I'll be interested to find out about that. But in the meantime, we're going to end here. And I want to thank you, Dr. Tom, and we will see everyone next time.
Thank you, Rob. I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited about this topic.
You've been listening to the Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.